Hey, welcome. Hope you're having a great day. This is the full-length video walkthrough of the Exchange Server 2013 CU2 service template for Virtual Machine Manager. So if you are trying to figure out how to automate your Exchange deployments, you want to use them, you want to deploy them to virtual machines, and you want to make it as automated as possible, you've come to the right place. There is another video on this. It's only 60 seconds long. It's real flashy, you know, zooming in, zooming out, text flying in, some raging music in the background. We're going to link that up at the top of the blog post. This one is kind of a sidekick to the written material that you find in the blog post. So the purpose and the reason and the audience for having this would be if you're reading through the blog post and you think, okay, I get it, but it would just be nice if I could watch somebody walk me through it one time to kind of get a feel for which dialog boxes he's going to and you know what he's clicking on, then this is your go-to resource. It's probably going to be about 40 minutes long, and that includes pausing the video during the actual deployment so that we don't have an hour of just a progress bar going by. So keep in mind that you're probably not going to watch this whole thing. You're probably going to watch bits and pieces to go look through and try to figure out exactly how this compares to your environment and what you need to do to get this set up. So this is what I've got on the screen is pretty much a greenfield environment. I've got 4 hosts. I've got a System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2012 R2 server running on top of System Center or Windows Server 2012 R2 hosts running server core. And so what we're going to do is kind of walk through how this is set up in terms of networking. We're going to take a look at that data VHDX file and the contents of that, and then we're going to import the service templates, get them configured, kick off the deployment, and then hopefully we come back, we'll have a brand new Exchange organization, and we can get logged into the browser, maybe create a new database and see what that's all about. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's the 2 hosts that I'm actually going to be using today. You can see I've got one VM here. And what I'm going to do, I've been using this for previous testing. The way that I'm doing this, if you're running your own test lab, obviously you can't roll back checkpoints on a domain controller, or you can screw up computer passwords and all sorts of things. So what I've done is to checkpoint the machine just after I click go on the domain controller promotion. And so what that allows me to do is roll it back to where it was not a domain controller anymore, and then allow it to go ahead and get restored, finish out the process, reboot, and when it comes online, it's a domain controller in a new domain. The forest is the same name, so as long as I'm deploying greenfield and this is the only thing in the environment, that actually works out pretty well. So while that's running, let's go take a look at the network. And you can see I've got my host network. I'm not really doing anything with it for this project, but I do have what I'm calling the Contoso logical network, which is honestly just a crossover cable between those 2 servers. It just allows me to create a little network between the 2 hosts, and I can have all of my VMs talk on that. I do have one IP pool, and that just allows me to kind of skirt around not having DHCP and not wanting to go in and actually statically assign everything. So it's really, really convenient for me to just say, let VMM just handle all of the IP assignments, and it makes my life super, super easy. I do have just the one site, and you can see it's just that Class C. And then I've got one logical switch created that's mapped back to, with no filters, no uplink port, map back to that logical network. And then if I go to my VM network, there's my Contoso logical network mapping. So pretty straightforward in terms of the networking. I mean, basically that representation, what that would create is a virtual switch on each host named Contoso. It's not allowing the physical adapter to be shared by the host or anything like that. No VLAN assignment, and it hands out, or it statically assigns IPs as new VMs come online. And that's pretty much it. If I go to the library, the next thing that I want to show, if I go under VHDs, there is my data VHD. Now, if you've read the blog post, then you know that there are 4 things I needed to download that I placed inside this disk. You're going to want this one to be a fixed size VHD, and you're going to determine the capacity based on how big your Exchange database and the logs that go there as well, how big they probably will grow to. So if it could be a large environment, it may be hundreds of gig. It could be over a terabyte. If it's a smaller environment, your mileage may vary. There's the UCMA download. You can see I don't have any scripts. I don't have any batch files. I'm just putting these things into folders. And then what I do is whenever I set up the application configuration, we call these executables. And there's the one security update as of today's date that exists for Exchange 2013 CU2. The nice thing about this CU2 download is that it can be used either for an in-place upgrade of your existing Exchange environment, or it can be used for a full install. So I don't have to go out and download the MSDN media or the media from the volume license site for Exchange 2013 RTM and then do a CU2 upgrade. I just download the CU2 and then which is cumulative update number 2, and then I just use that as my source. So that works out very well. And I'm just going to eject a couple of things that I had mounted up out of the library. And if you want more information about how to create that VHD file, there are some blog posts out there, but just a real quick guide. If you go into disk management and go to action, here's create VHD. This is where you would go in and say, okay, this is going to be 80 gig. It's a VHDX fixed size. Tell me where to create it. I can make it 80 terabyte if I had the drive space. So really easy to create that. Once it's there, it'll show up in this lower portion. You can initialize the disk, bring it online. You can format it. It'll have a drive letter. You copy your stuff in. And you can copy it to your VMM library and refresh that library, or you can, if you need to make changes to it later, you can do as I've done here, which is to open the file directly from the library, and you can make whatever changes you want. You don't have to re-import it or anything like that. So if I go up to VM templates, you'll see that I do have one VM template here for Windows Server 2012 RTM. That's the operating system that's supported for Exchange Server 2013 CU2. I don't know any information about their future roadmap for support on R2 or anything like that, but I found this to be the easiest way to get my sysprepped VHD ready to go to be used in a service template. So I just built a VM, installed 2012, told the VMM that I wanted to create a template using that VM, and it sysprepped it, shut it down, put it in the library for me. I've got the metadata stored there, so if I ever want to use this VM template in the future to roll out just a standalone VM, I've got it. But what's most important to me is that I've got the VHD file that it created, and I'm going to use that whenever I bring in these service templates. So if I go to import template, this is exactly what you will have if you have downloaded the zip file from the TechNet gallery and unzipped it. There's the single server. There is the operating system. You can see I've got these 4 configuration or these 4 references within this environment. Within each of these service templates, they're the same for single server as well as for the multi-server, and I'll explain the difference. But basically, I just need to map out to my my virtual hard drive that has the operating system, the virtual hard drive that is the data VHDX, and then I have 2 run as accounts. Now, depending on your environment, I recognize that the run as account could be a very different object depending on where you're coming from. So in my case, this is just an isolated test lab. I'm using the domain administrator account. It has enterprise admin rights so that whenever I do schema extensions and I'm preparing the domain to be populated with Exchange data, it has all the rights that it needs. It could be that if you were working in a production environment, you might do these things. You might extend the schema and prepare AD for Exchange manually ahead of time using an account with the proper permissions, in which case your install account could be much lower privilege. It could be that you're looking at chaining a number of things together using a workflow engine like System Center Orchestrator, and that you might use a specialized account where you enter credentials at some point in the workflow, and it goes and does the work without ever storing the credentials. It could be that you execute this via script and prompt for credentials. It could be if you're in some sort of a hosting environment that you provision using high privilege accounts, and then you rein in those accounts whenever you're done before turning over access, and that way the accounts are stored anywhere. Lots of different approaches that you could take to this type of environment. For a test lab like this, just using this run as account works really well. It's a very simple process. And I would say the real world scenario where you might see something like that, if you had an isolated test environment and you were creating kind of a mirror of your environment so that you could go test changes, it might be a scenario where you would consider something like that, because the exception to it being a mirror might be that you don't have production data. You just have a mirror of your production design. So we're going to go ahead and open this in Designer. You can see that this is a very simple template, just a single server. I do not have it set with scale out enabled, which means that once it's deployed, it's deployed. I could do that. I could just check this box and allow it to scale out additional servers. We'll take a look at what that would mean when we look at the multi-server environment. But for this one, I'm really just focused on developing this single server environment. Now, what we're going to do is kind of stack these things together in our test today. So we're going to deploy the single server environment, and then we're going to add the multi-server environment on top of it, and we'll see what that looks like. I've got this just set based on the best practices document as minimum specs for the VM for virtualizing Exchange. You can obviously, if you are looking at possibly using something like this in production, and you're going to have real users talking to it, you may want to have several more processors and much more memory assigned to the VM. For my case, this works just fine. You can see the network is going to prompt. The way this works is I can say use configurable service setting and then set a parameter, which is just a variable with a variable name with the @ symbol on each side. So VM network is what I'm using there. As by virtue of selecting the items in the configure references dialog, there's my VHDs. If we go to the OS configuration for the name, it's just going to be EX and then a counter. So the machine that gets deployed is going to be named ex01.contoso.com. I am going to set my password. There's a couple of things in here, such as the local administrator password, that I just decided rather than try to include something like that in the service template, it would be easier just to have a couple of minor configuration steps after it's been imported. For the product key, rather than give my product key to the world, what I'm going to do is pause the video, and then I will hit copy and paste. I'll hit OK, and then I'll come right back to this dialog box, and what you'll see is a series of dots instead of my actual product key. So bear with me. And there we go. If I move down, you will find I've got all the roles pre-populated according to documentation, as well as the features. If we go down to domain and group, I'm going to set this to join the contoso.com domain. And just for convenience, I'm going to use that run as account. And this is another case where you could provide those credentials via script if it made more sense for your environment. If I go to application install, there is the documented unattend command for the UCMA runtime setup, as well as for the Office filter pack. You can see in each of those cases, we're running as the system account. Neither of those installs require any kind of network access, so that works out really well. And then for the third case, that's where I'm using that Exchange install account. And just take a real quick look at the command line for this Exchange install. We're running setup.exe. We're using the install mode. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. For the organization name, that's where I'm again using a parameter. So you'll see that is our second parameter when we go to do the deployment. The first it asks for the network, and then it asks for the organization name. For which roles, in this case, because it's a single server, I'm adding both client access server as well as mailbox server roles. I am accepting the EULA, which in turn means that you are accepting the EULA whenever you deploy this, so keep that in mind. For the database name and database file name, I'm using the same thing. It's the host name _ default. And this was a little bit of a debate for a while, but I was uncertain what to name the database. The Exchange guys told me I should have a unique database name for every database in the organization, and that I should follow some basic naming standards. In order to make this something that I could easily repeat and make it sort of a one-click process, I didn't want to have to parameterize too many variables. So especially in a scale out scenario. I wanted to make it very, very simple. And so the second bit of information that I found in researching this is that it is not uncommon after you've deployed the Exchange to then go in and create a new database and use that for your database availability group. So my thinking on this as sort of a compromise was server underscore default. That'll be just the default first database that's created for these servers. If it's a single standalone server, then that'll work just fine. If you create a new database and you start using that for a DAG, then you could even move your system mailboxes over there and delete the original mailbox, or you can just keep them separated. It's up to you. Either way, I don't see too much of a conflict, and it kind of works out as a nice compromise. So let's scroll on over. I'll show you that the log files are also written out to that secondary drive. We've got a final parameter here, which is reaches out to the updates folder. So in the future, if additional security updates were to come out, you could drop them into that updates folder by mounting up that data VHD, just like what we walked through earlier. And then every time you deploy Exchange using this method, you'll always be using the latest and greatest of updates and the latest and greatest of code. So that works out really well. The nice thing about the R2 environment is that you can control the timeout for these scripts. So I give it a full hour. In most cases, executing this script itself really doesn't take that long, but I give it an hour just so that if it happens to hit a slower machine, I don't ever have timeouts. So none of the remaining values are requirements. If you wanted to set some tags or quota points, certainly that would be something that you could set. I'll hit OK. And then this will take just a second to save because we've introduced some new data. It's right into the database. I'll hit save just to make sure, and then I'm going to hit configure deployment. And what we will see is that we are saving off a deployment configuration for this instance. I'm going to have it talk to the Contoso VM network that I showed you earlier. My name is just SSA1 for Single Server Architecture 1. And as the deployment screen comes up, the first thing I will do is hit, I'm going to name my organization Contoso, and you can see I've got descriptions for all of the parameters so you can kind of get a feel for what to type in there. I'll hit refresh preview, and it's going to pick a host for me. And I wondered if that might happen. So I'll show you a quick trick. If what comes back for your service template is not a host that you are looking for, you can hit select, come back. Now it'll gray this box out. I'll hit refresh preview, and it'll give me the host rating for the VM or the host that I selected. And for the multi-server environment, I will probably just do that manually across all of them. There we go. I know in advance that that's where I want this VM to end up, so that works out. Let's hit deploy. And what we're going to do is let the single server architecture go ahead and run while we're importing the multi-server architecture and taking a look at that. Like I said, it's going to take about an hour. We might as well let it run, and we'll go ahead and let that go in the background. And I'll show you, here's the service deployment configuration that's been stored for that new service. If we go to look at the hosts and click on services, still in its early phases, so it's not even showing up as a service yet, but there you can see it's deploying the VHD over to the host, it's creating the configuration, and it'll bring that machine online. Let's go back to the library, and I'm going to import my second template, which is the multi-server. Now, to explain the difference, the single server architecture is literally that. As you saw, it's one VM, both Exchange roles, standalone box. And a multi-server configuration, the way that I've built out the service template, is to separate the client access server and the mailbox servers. It's not uncommon, I found from talking to people, to also have the client access server role on what I would consider to be the back tier, the mailbox servers, so that for any reason they can't talk to the environment, you have a networking failure or something, that you can still open a browser, open ECP, and manage that machine. So you can set this up however you want. This truly is a working example, and you can deploy these however you feel is the best fit according to your standards for Exchange configuration. In this case, I'm just deploying them out separately. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but you can check this box or not check it. There are no sensitive values stored in these service templates, so either way. Okay, so same 4 values here. Let's go ahead and select that VHD. I'm not using it for anything else except for these service templates. And there's my data file. I'm going to go back to that same run as account, and I really don't have to check this one, but I like to just validate to make sure. And we'll hit import. All right, let's open that new service template in Designer. And what you'll see is by default, I've got it set up to have 2 mailbox servers and 2 client access servers. Just for fun, since we are adding to an existing environment, let's go ahead and crank up to 3 client access servers. Now, the one thing you'll see when I deploy this, I'm deploying this into a pair of hosts. So I'm going to end up with 6 VMs across 2 hosts. If making the environment highly available is your goal, then 2 hosts for 6 VMs that are all representing the same service is not, the math doesn't work out that well. You'd be more likely to separate these across multiple hosts, and that way if you lose a host, you may even put a mailbox server and a client access server per host or something like that, depending on the performance requirements. So let's go ahead and look at the properties of our mailbox server. I want to point out one thing. If you were looking at the screen before in Designer, you saw that big green hash or plus sign where the application is. Given that this is Virtual Machine Manager 2012 R2, you'll notice I actually have Exchange showing up as an application in this service template. And the reason behind that, there's a new type, and that is script application. So when this opens up, when we get to script the application configuration, I'll explain what that means in full detail. Exactly the same setup as before. You can see I do have the scale out option here. We'll take a look at that once we get deployed. Same thing for the hardware. For the OS configuration, for the name, I include MBX as an abbreviation for mailbox server. You can change that to whatever your best practices are for your environment. I'm going to set my password. And then I'm going to do the same thing where I pause the video for just a second. So hold on. There we go. Same thing. I don't have to modify the roles or features at all. I'm going to go into domain, contoso.com. And that should do it. I want to real quick show you the application configuration. So what I've done here is added this script application type. You'll see it is the same as the other, with the exception that I'm only adding the role of mailbox. The nice thing about 2012 R2 in this script application type is I could specify a PowerShell script block. So if I wanted to do something more complex, and something I thought about for this case is if you had your Exchange commandlets available or something along those lines, there might be a way that you could go out and find the existing database names for your Exchange organization and provided a new name for the new Exchange database for this new server, following your existing naming standards and not relying on the host name. That might be interesting, possibly something we'll come back to later. It's just an idea I wanted to throw out there if you're looking at how you might modify this for your own use. I don't require any unique environment variables, but you'll see pre-install 1, pre-install 2 are exactly the same as what we had in the SSA. But then we have this new thing at the bottom. This is really, really great. So if you look at your script command type, you'll see that we can now execute pre-post scripts based on the first VM individuality. So in this case, the reason that I found this to be so interesting is if I wasn't deploying that SSA first, I would be thinking about how I was going to get my schema extended. So in this case, that single server architecture is going to take care of extending the schema in my test environment. I don't have to worry about it. What will happen then is whenever this script runs, it will recognize that the schema has already been extended, and then it'll just move on. So kudos to the Exchange team for getting that. Their installer they got it right. It's a really, really elegant tool. What I'm using this for in the case of if I was deploying this multi-server architecture into my test lab and it was the first set of things to go live, so I can build it out as a set of computer tiers, and the mailbox server would come online first, and the client access server tier. I've got 2 mailbox servers. I develop a race condition where these 2 VMs are coming online at about the same time. They're going to be running setup at about the same time, and they're both going to be trying to extend the schema. They're probably not going to have the first one finish before the second one goes out to do a check. So now you've got them both thinking that they need to extend the schema. in this case, whichever one of them gets there first, and it may be very close, but whichever one of them gets there first, it'll be the first VM online, so it's going to execute this additional step and go out and extend the schema. Once that's done, it'll run Exchange application install. So this works out really well as a tool to go out and extend that schema and then go in and add the additional roles. What I had considered for 2012 SP1 was having a third computer tier that was just a single mailbox server, and its job basically was just to come online first to get the schema extended and then bring additional mailbox server tier online just for scale out. It was a little bit messy. I didn't really like it, and I was very happy to see 2012 R2 provides this additional functionality. The other thing that I had been toying around with is the idea of making this a truly elastic environment, meaning as I set it up now, it's easy to scale out or to grow that environment. I had thought about, well, what if you wanted to remove servers out of it? It's a process in an Exchange organization where you do not want to just delete a VM and leave the configuration information about that server and that database out there in the stored information about that organization in the Active Directory. And so you really want to run the uninstall commands for Exchange to get that data cleaned up, and then you can go back and purge out your VMs. You could, remember I mentioned that there's a mode parameter for Exchange. You could run that uninstall and make that what happens during VM deletion. So you could build this out to be a truly elastic environment. People I talked to, I did not find one person who was interested in removing nodes for Exchange after they deployed it out. So I'm really just focused on running this one for the creation of the first VM. And you can see, just like the applications, I've got the log files going out here to c:/install. So that's a lot of detail for that application configuration, but I'm very excited about this ability in R2. Again, no further configuration required there, so I'm just going to hit OK, and then I'm going to, as quickly as I can, do this for the same thing for the client access server, where I just need to set that password and add that product key, but really not making any changes otherwise. So in your case, like I said, you might want to add some additional capacity to that hardware. We will set our password. I'm going to add my product key. Hold on just a second. There we go. And I'm going to set my domain properties. And no changes required for the client access server. A very similar command. I'm only adding the client access role, accepting the EULA, etc. There's my 2 pre-install steps. And now we have our multi-server service template all configured. I'm going to wait for this to finish. I'll hit save and validate. And then I'm going to hit configure deployment. All right, let's call this MSA1. And we'll select our network. Now I have to use the same organization name, only still only one org per forest. So when this next screen comes up, I will just populate that organization name, and then, like I said, I'm going to pick and choose where I want these VMs to fall. So let's put MBX02 on 219. And then we'll put MBX01 on 220. And then for my client access servers, you see what I was saying earlier, where I said this is really not following the best practices for high availability here. I'm just sort of staggering out where these VMs can go because of the limitations of my test environment. Certainly in a production environment, you'd be separating them out across a greater number of hosts, and possibly even deploying to multiple sites. And I mentioned at the bottom of the blog in the best practices section that the data VHD, before this goes into production, should be moved off onto a separate set of spindles than where the operating system is running. So what that really means is, out of those 2 VHD files or VHDX files that make up each VM that constitutes this service, The best practice would be that the physical drives where those files reside would be different. Now, if you're running on a big RAID 10 array, that's happening naturally. But if you are running all on local storage, then it's not uncommon to have multiple drives or disk arrays, and you want to do your best to separate those out so that the I/O across those drives is separated. And that'll help a lot in terms of performance. You can also consider adding additional VHD files so that if you want to add additional databases with additional set of log files, that you can control where that's going to land and make sure that it's separated out across those disks for best performance, best I/O. So we've got this all set up. That should work. I'm going to hit deploy. And it's kind of like old Captain Picard saying engage. So this is going to kick off that deployment. As soon as this gets things running, we're going to switch over to jobs view. I'll go up and check the status of the single server architecture deployment. We'll verify that the bits jobs for all 5 of these VMs are active and that these things are getting rolled out. And then I will pause the video. So let's take a quick look. Yeah, we're cruising right along on the SSA. What I want to see, so when we get down to this parallel execution step, basically everything up here has been creating that VM. And then as we get to this step, in maybe 10 or 15 minutes, we'll see this expand out, and it will actually show as it's going step by step through that application install for the pre-install 1, pre-install 2, and then the pre-install 3 where it actually installs Exchange. If we go up here, we can see each of those bits jobs, background intelligent transfer service, is firing up and copying the VHD file out to the host where it will start the VM, customize it, and then install that Exchange application in each of those cases. If I go to VMs and services, let's go out and look at services. And so this is truly your Exchange as a service getting rolled out. And the reason we call these scale out is after we get deployed, I will take a look at this, but you can right click and hit scale out and add additional nodes for that type. So what I am going to do now is pause the recording. This is going to take an hour and a half with all these things running at the same time. I am going to, maybe go get a soda or eat a sandwich or something. This will seem like moments for you, but hours for me. So I'm going to pause the video and we will reconnect whenever hopefully these things turn green and we have Exchange available for testing. All right, there you go. There's your complete Exchange environment with the single server template as well as the scaled out multi-server environment. To be perfectly fair, I had to restart the environment and then I just let it run overnight and came back in the morning. So it didn't take too long to complete. If I go back and look at the actual job, it looks like it took a little bit over an hour, but the problem was the snapshot on the domain controller that we rolled back to make it a not domain controller and then let it promote included a reference to a virtual network name that's no longer present. I'd renamed the VM network prior to starting the recording. So when I rolled it back, it lost its connection. So everything tried to join the domain, it all failed. So I just fixed that in the domain controller and then kicked everything off just as we had before. And you can see everything finished. Everything looks really good. What I'm going to do here is go ahead. We've got obviously 3 mailbox servers here and 3 of the front-end client access servers. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of these boxes. If I come in here and log in, the first thing I like to do is turn off that enhanced security for Internet Explorer, just so I can run a quick test on this local machine. So for that, we're going to go ahead and let Server Manager open, and we'll use that as a shortcut to get there. And here is IE Enhanced Security. Just for administrators and just temporarily, I'm going to disable this. And then if I come back to the start menu, now obviously I have not set up virtual directory names and I have not imported a trusted certificate. We're still using the self-signed cert. It's very important you understand that that's something, if you were rolling this into a production environment, those are things that have to be completed, because what can happen is the Outlook clients they're trying to connect, if you deploy an Exchange server into an Active Directory site where there are production users and the Outlook client discovers, I need to use SSL, and the Outlook client discovers that that server is in its site, it will try to connect and it will get that self-signed certificate that's not trusted, which will result in an error. And initially what users would see is just some prompting, are you sure you want to trust this certificate, things like that, very similar to what you've got here. And then long-term you would see some of the Outlook components actually start to fail, not irrecoverably, but it would just be things like calendar views and things like that that don't have a way of dealing with a non-trusted certificate. They would just stop working until that gets corrected. So let's go ahead and get logged in. So long term, I may publish some blog posts around automating some of those steps. We've talked about it a little bit, and the tricky part of that is if you're going out and getting a public certificate, of course, every provider's APIs are a little bit different, and we don't want to play favorites. So what we could do is automate retrieving it from an internal CA. So we'll take a look at that down the road. Let this get logged in, and all we're going to do is validate that we can see all of the servers, that we can see the mailbox databases, and then we're going to go ahead and do a scale out of one of those front-end server roles. And that will be another case where I pause the video because it will do a full additional VM deployment. I guess I didn't get my click. There we go. And it looks like we've got an IE problem. I'll let it reconnect here. It's not the first time that I've seen that happen when opening ECP for the first time in a new machine. All right, so our authentication carried over. So you can see I've just got the administrator mailbox. If I go down here to servers, there we go. So there's our single server with both roles. There's our 3 client access boxes. There's our mailbox database. Independent servers. We should see all 3 databases here. And this is where obviously we could consider creating a new one. And we could go ahead and create a database availability group. We can come back to that. In the meantime, what I want to do is go ahead and do a scale out, just so you can kind of see how we would do that. So the purpose of scale out is to say, once these computer tiers are defined and it's completely automated in its deployment, we should be able to very easily add additional nodes to that computer tier. And so what we would do is right click here and hit scale out. I'm going to leave everything at default. I'm literally not going to change anything, which will mean it's just going to follow the same standards that we set in that deployment configuration. There we go. We'll go ahead and use 219. And I don't have any additional settings or properties to add. There we go, that looks fine. It's just, you can see that number sequence carries on. So 1, 2, 3, and then the new one would be 4. It's going to use the same hard drive images. And I'm going to leave everything at default here. And I'll just click scale out. Now this could be scripted. So you truly could have a situation where, especially if you were working this into an orchestrator workflow, where you could say, as it looks like we're getting more users connecting, maybe we're scaling out an enterprise environment, as that performance demand grows, then you could just kick off that script and go ahead and scale out. You could actually make that something that's reactive to monitoring. So you could say, we've got host capacity somewhere, and we're deploying out for remote sites. If it looks like we've underestimated the utilization of that site, then on demand, we could add an additional role, such as what you're seeing here. So I'm going to pause the video and let this run. And hopefully when we come back, we will then have 4 client access servers, and we'll wrap things up. There we go. Welcome back. So the 4th client access server deployed successfully. You can see I have closed and reopened the console, so it's a different sort order. But if I right-click and connect via console, I've already logged into this server to validate, but I'm just going to walk you through exactly what this would look like. So if we log in as the administrator account, and I've already turned off enhanced security mode, so we can take a little shortcut here. Now, Virtual Machine Manager does have the capability of also managing your load balancers, whether it be NLB or a hardware load balancer. So you can imagine if you were truly chaining all these steps together, including handling certificates and things like that, that you could make this a true end-to-end one-click process for scale out that potentially even could be triggered by monitoring. So it's a really interesting and a neat technology here. So there's my administrator mailbox and the servers. There's my 4th client access server. And there's my 3 databases. So what would be great, and I will try to get this done, is to schedule some time with someone from the CAT team for Exchange and maybe go into more detail about what it would look like if we add that additional database and extend that database availability group, kind of a what needs to happen next after you've deployed Exchange to continue this workflow, and walk through the certificate changes, and maybe we can automate some of those steps as well. But this is a very good step in the right direction. Certainly, if you were an enterprise administrator, to reduce the scale out of your environment down to a 1 hour and just a few clicks, and then come back and finish this up with some manual work on the end, saves a tremendous amount of time. So this is a really, really neat tool, and look forward to reading your comments on the blog. So please leave feedback, and if there are additional things that you would like to see that would be a job aid or that would be helpful, then I'm interested in listening and potentially looking at considering those for projects. So look forward to reading your comments. Thanks very much. I guess I'll talk to you next time.